My mom worshipped my brother while I was the family scapegoat. So I finally called them out. The fallout was explosive, and then growing up in Springfield, Ohio, I was always the one my family relied on. You know the type. Dependable, responsible, the glue that held everything together. It's not that I minded being the one to step up. I took pride in it at first. But over time, it became exhausting, especially when my younger brother Brian, for years my junior, coasted through life as the family's golden child. Brian has always been charming, effortlessly winning people over with his humor and laid-back attitude. Mom, Sharon, practically worships the ground he walks on. It didn't matter if he forgot a commitment, let someone down, or made life harder for everyone around him. Mom always had an excuse. He's just wired differently, Maggie, she'd say, brushing off whatever mess Brian had left in his wake. Don't let it bother you so much. Bother me? It was hard not to feel frustrated when Brian could do no wrong in Mom's eyes. Anytime he made a mistake, it was treated like a harmless quirk. Meanwhile, I was held to a completely different standard. If I complained about the disparity, Mom's favorite phrase would cut through the air. Be the bigger person, Maggie. That line became her answer to everything. If Brian ruined my school project as a kid, I was told to forgive him because he was just a child. When he let slip a private job interview I was preparing for years later, it was the same old story. Don't let it get to you. You're better than that. For years, I swallowed my pride and played my role, believing that was what families did. I told myself it wasn't worth causing conflict, that keeping the peace was more important than holding Brian accountable. But it wore on me. Every time he dodged responsibility or embarrassed me, and Mom waved it off, a small part of me started to resent both of them. The breaking point came a couple of weeks ago at a family dinner. It started like any other. Chatter about work, local news, and a few harmless jokes. But then Brian decided to put me in the spotlight. Maggie, you know you overthink everything, right? He said, grinning as he leaned back in his chair. His tone was light, but it was loud enough for everyone to hear. The room fell quiet, and all eyes turned to me. My cheeks burned with humiliation. I wanted to fire back, to call him out for yet another dig at my expense, but years of conditioning held me back. I forced a smile and bit my tongue. Mom, as usual, brushed it off with a laugh. Oh, Brian, stop teasing your sister. Maggie, don't let him get under your skin. There it was again. Let it go. Be the bigger person. The same refrain I'd heard my whole life. I sat there, quietly seething as the conversation moved on. But something was different this time. This wasn't the first time Brian had humiliated me, and I knew it wouldn't be the last. He had a knack for pushing boundaries and then acting like the victim when anyone dared to push back. As I sat there, memories started flooding back. Like the time he sabotaged my 7th grade science project. I'd worked on it for weeks, and Brian destroyed it in a fit of boredom. Mom didn't punish him. Instead, she hugged him and told me to let it go. Or the time he let slip about my private job interview during a family gathering. I didn't get the job, and I couldn't help but wonder if his comments about my nerves had planted a seed of doubt in the hiring manager's mind. Did he ever apologize? Of course not. And it wasn't just about me. Brian had a long history of dodging family responsibilities. If Dad needed help fixing something around the house, Brian would magically disappear. If a relative's birthday came up, he'd conveniently have other plans. It was always left to me, or someone else, to pick up the slack. Yet somehow, he remained the golden child. Brian's just different, Mom would say, as if that justified everything. But that night, as I stared at his smug grin across the dinner table, something inside me snapped. I realized I was done being the bigger person. I was tired of swallowing my pride for the sake of family unity, tired of letting Brian's actions slide while Mom enabled him at every turn. For years, I had believed that avoiding conflict was the right thing to do. I thought it made me mature, responsible, and even noble. But now, I saw it for what it really was. A way to keep Brian comfortable, no matter how much it hurt the rest of us. I left that dinner determined to make a change. I didn't know exactly how I would go about it, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let Brian walk all over me anymore. And I wasn't going to let Mom guilt me into silence. For once, I was ready to stand up for myself. After that dinner, I couldn't shake the weight of everything Brian had done over the years. It wasn't just about his comment that night. It was about a pattern that had gone on for far too long. Every insult, every missed responsibility, every time he made me the butt of a joke or left me cleaning up his mess, it all came rushing back. I spent the next morning pacing around my apartment, sipping coffee that had gone cold. My mind replayed all the moments when Brian had crossed the line. He'd always been good at making his jabs seem harmless, disguising them as jokes. But they weren't jokes. They were small daggers meant to humiliate me, knowing full well that I wouldn't fight back. I thought about the science project he ruined. I had been so proud of that experiment, carefully crafting a miniature weather station for weeks. The night before it was due, Brian came into my room, bored and looking for attention. Without thinking, he knocked it off the desk, shattering everything. When I screamed at him, he just laughed. Mom rushed in, saw the mess, and dismissed it like it was nothing. He didn't mean it, Maggie, she said, pulling Brian into a hug. Don't make a big deal out of this. I was 12 years old, and I learned then what I've been told my entire life. Let it go, Maggie. Be the bigger person. As an adult, the stakes only got higher. A couple of years ago, I had a big interview for a job I desperately wanted at a marketing firm in Columbus. I didn't tell anyone in the family about it except Mom. I should have known better, though, because somehow, Brian found out. At a family barbecue the weekend before my interview, he blurted it out in front of everyone. Maggie's got a big job interview coming up, he said, grinning. Hope your nerves don't get the best of you. I could feel the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it. Loud, sarcastic, and just enough to plant doubt in everyone's mind, including mine. I didn't get the job. I'll never know if his comment had anything to do with it, but it still stung. When I confronted him afterward, he waved me off with a laugh. Relax, Maggie. I was just kidding. You need to lighten up. Mom backed him up, of course. Brian didn't mean anything by it, she said. You're too sensitive sometimes. Too sensitive. That's what they always called me when I reacted to Brian's behavior. Sensitive, uptight, dramatic. I wore those labels like scars, reminders of every time I tried to stand up for myself and was told to sit back down. But that morning, pacing my apartment, something shifted. I didn't feel like sitting down anymore. I picked up my phone and opened the family group chat. It was full of the usual banter, mostly from Brian. He had sent a meme about overthinking, clearly poking fun at me again. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I finally responded. Brian, that comment wasn't funny. It was uncalled for. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. His reply came within minutes. Relax, Maggie. It's not that deep. The group chat went quiet after that. I could almost feel the awkwardness through the screen. Brian was used to me letting things slide, and my decision to speak up clearly caught him off guard. But he still didn't take it seriously. Later that day, my phone rang. It was Mom. Her voice carried that familiar tone of exasperation, the one she used whenever she thought I was making a big deal out of something. Maggie, can't you just let this go? You know how Brian is. For once, I didn't argue. I didn't yell or try to defend myself. I simply said, I'm not ignoring it anymore, Mom. The silence on the other end of the line told me she wasn't expecting that response. She started to say something else, but I cut her off. I've let it go too many times. This time, I'm standing up for myself. After a long pause, she muttered something about not wanting drama and hung up. A few days later, I learned there was another family dinner coming up, this time at Aunt Karen's house in Dayton. It was one of those big gatherings where everyone showed up, cousins, aunts, uncles, even family friends. These were the events where Brian thrived. He charmed the room, making everyone laugh and leaving them talking about how fun and easygoing he was. But this time, I saw it as an opportunity. If Brian wanted to play his usual games, I was going to make sure the rules were different. Before the dinner, Dad pulled me aside while I was visiting my parents. He rarely got involved in family drama, but this time he surprised me. Maggie, he said quietly, you're not wrong to call Brian out. He's been getting away with too much for years. I stared at him, shocked. Dad had never openly acknowledged the dynamic before, let alone sided with me. I didn't say anything before because I didn't want to cause tension, he admitted. But I'll back you up if things get out of hand. Hearing that gave me a strange sense of relief. For the first time, I wouldn't feel completely alone in this. Meanwhile, Brian was his usual self. I overheard from my cousin Kelly that he'd been joking about me behind my back. She's on a power trip, he'd said. She'll cool off eventually. He wasn't taking me seriously, but that only solidified my resolve. I stopped engaging with him entirely. No sarcastic replies, no frustrated comebacks, just silence. It clearly unsettled him. At one point, during a casual family meetup, he tried to bait me with a snide comment about how I was too busy for the family group chat. I smiled politely and walked away. His smirk faltered, but he didn't push further. The night of Aunt Karen's dinner arrived, and I was ready. The house was bustling with laughter and conversation as everyone caught up. Brian was in his element, making jokes and soaking up the attention. I kept my distance, chatting with cousins and pretending not to notice him. But I was waiting for the right moment. And when it came, I wasn't going to let it slip by. When I arrived at Aunt Karen's house in Dayton for the family dinner, I was determined to stick to my plan. The house was buzzing with the usual sounds of chatter and laughter. Relatives were scattered everywhere, some in the living room catching up, others in the kitchen helping Aunt Karen finish setting the table. I greeted everyone warmly, keeping my tone light and cheerful, but I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. Brian was in his usual spot, the center of attention. He was surrounded by a group of cousins and family friends, cracking jokes and reliving old stories that conveniently left out any of his missteps. He had this effortless way of charming people, making them believe he was the easygoing, funny guy who could do no wrong. I kept my distance for most of the evening, chatting with my cousin Kelly and a few other relatives who had always been supportive. Kelly leaned in at one point and whispered, "You okay? You seem quieter than usual." I nodded and gave her a small smile, just waiting for the right moment. When we all finally sat down for dinner, the conversation flowed easily. The table was packed with plates of roasted chicken, green beans, and cornbread. Family gatherings like this had always been a mix of nostalgia and chaos. The older relatives reminisced about the past, while the younger ones tried to keep their phones out of sight to avoid scolding from the adults. At some point, the conversation naturally shifted to funny family memories. Brian, of course, seized the opportunity to insert himself. He launched into a story about a vacation we took to Myrtle Beach when we were kids. As he spoke, I could feel his eyes darting toward me occasionally, like he was testing the waters. Then he said it. "You know, Maggie's always been the serious one," he said with a grin, his voice loud enough to grab everyone's attention. I swear, even when we were kids, she was like a little adult, worrying about everything. The table erupted in laughter, but I felt the familiar sting of embarrassment. Brian had a knack for taking the spotlight and twisting it into a subtle jab at my expense. I took a deep breath and decided it was time. "Hey, Brian," I said, keeping my tone calm. "Remember when you said I overthink everything at the last dinner? What did you mean by that?" The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. Brian blinked, clearly caught off guard. "It was just a joke, Maggie," he said, trying to laugh it off. "You're not still stuck on that, are you?" "Stuck on it?" I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You made a personal remark in front of everyone. I'm just asking if you think it's okay to make jokes at someone else's expense." The tension around the table was palpable. Brian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his usual confidence faltering. "I didn't mean anything by it," he muttered. Mom, sitting to my left, tried to intervene. "Maggie, let's not do this here. It's a family dinner." I turned to her, my voice calm but firm. "Mom, I'm tired of letting things slide. Brian has been making comments like this for years, and every time, I'm told to just let it go. Why is that?" For a moment, no one spoke. A few of my cousins exchanged uneasy glances. Kelly, sitting across from me, gave me a small nod of encouragement. Brian finally muttered a half-hearted apology. "Sorry if I upset you. I didn't mean to." I could tell he didn't mean it. His tone was dismissive, and he refused to make eye contact. But it was a start. I decided not to push further, At least not that night. Thank you, I said simply, though I wasn't satisfied. The conversation moved on awkwardly, but the atmosphere had shifted. For the first time, Brian had been called out in front of everyone, and it was clear he didn't know how to handle it. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Mom, and she didn't waste any time before launching into her usual lecture. "Maggie, you embarrassed Brian in front of the whole family," she said, her tone sharp. "You know how he is. Why couldn't you just let it go?" I stayed calm, even though my frustration was bubbling beneath the surface. "Mom, why is it always on me to keep the peace? Why do I have to be the bigger person every single time?" "Because you're stronger than he is," she said, as if that explained everything. "Brian's going through a lot right now. He doesn't need more stress." "What about what I'm going through?" I asked. "Does that not matter? Or does it only matter when Brian feels uncomfortable?" Mom didn't have an answer for that. After a moment of silence, she sighed and said, "We'll talk about this later," before hanging up. Over the next few days, the fallout from the dinner became clear. Brian had started spinning his own version of events, telling cousins and aunts that I was blowing things out of proportion and trying to cause drama in the family. A couple of relatives reached out to me, asking what was going on. "He's making himself look like the victim," I told Kelly during a phone call. "And people are eating it up." "Not everyone," she said reassuringly. "I've noticed some of the family starting to side with you. It's about time someone called Brian out." Hearing that gave me a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the dynamic was starting to shift. Then, something happened that I hadn't expected. Dad, who had always stayed out of these conflicts, spoke up during a casual family meetup. Someone made an offhand comment about the tension in the family, and before I could respond, Dad calmly said, "Brian's behavior has been unacceptable for years." Maggie was right to call him out. The room went silent. Brian froze, looking like he'd just been slapped. Mom tried to laugh it off, but Dad didn't let her. "It's time we stop pretending like this isn't a problem," he said. For the first time, I felt like someone was truly in my corner. Brian stormed out of the room, muttering under his breath, and Mom followed him, leaving everyone else in awkward silence. But I didn't care. I wasn't alone anymore, and that small victory felt like the first crack in Brian's golden image. After Dad stood up for me at the family gathering, it felt like a small victory, but I knew the real battle wasn't over. Brian had stormed out, furious that his golden child status had been publicly challenged, and Mom was quick to chase after him. I stayed back, surrounded by an uncomfortable silence, unsure how the rest of the family would react. Over the next week, the fallout began to spread. Brian wasn't one to suffer quietly. He made sure everyone knew how unfairly he was being treated. He painted me as the villain in his personal narrative, claiming I had blown everything out of proportion and was dragging the family into unnecessary drama. Cousins, aunts, and uncles started reaching out to me with the same cautious tone. "What's going on with you and Brian?" they'd ask, as if I were the one causing the tension. I explained calmly each time, sticking to the facts. I wasn't looking to start a fight, but I wasn't willing to let Brian's behavior slide anymore. Some relatives surprised me. They admitted they'd noticed Brian's pattern of dodging responsibility or making backhanded comments, but had never said anything to avoid stirring the pot. My cousin Kelly was one of the few who consistently had my back, offering encouragement whenever Brian's narrative seemed to gain traction. "You're doing the right thing," she told me over coffee one morning. "It's hard, but it's time someone stood up to him. People are starting to see the real Brian, whether they admit it or not." Not everyone was on my side, though. Mom was furious. She called me nearly every day, alternating between pleading and scolding. "Maggie, you're tearing this family apart," she said during one of those calls. "Brian's under so much stress already, and you're only making it worse." "Mom, I'm not tearing the family apart," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Brian's actions are. And maybe if you'd held him accountable years ago, we wouldn't be here now." "That's not fair," she snapped. "I've done my best to keep this family together." "No, Mom," I said firmly. "You've done your best to keep Brian comfortable, and the rest of us have paid the price for it." She hung up after that, clearly upset, but I didn't feel guilty. For the first time, I was saying what I'd been holding in for years, and I wasn't going to apologize for it. Brian, meanwhile, was escalating. He started posting vague, passive-aggressive updates on social media, the kind designed to rally sympathy without naming names. One post read, "Crazy how some people will twist the truth to make themselves look better. Family is supposed to stick together, not tear each other down." His friends and acquaintances, most of whom didn't know the full story, flooded the comments with support. "Stay strong, Brian. You're better than that drama. Family can be the worst sometimes." It was infuriating, but I refused to engage. Then came the family group chat. Brian posted a snarky comment clearly aimed at me. "Some people just can't let go of the past. Holding grudges only makes things worse." I didn't respond, but my silence didn't stop the drama. Dad, to my surprise, decided to step in. "Brian," he wrote, "this needs to stop. We've ignored the real problem for years, and it's time to face it. You owe Maggie, and the rest of the family, an apology." The group chat exploded. Brian immediately fired back, accusing Dad of favoritism and claiming he'd always felt like the outsider in our family. It was a wild accusation, considering how much Mom had coddled him over the years, but Brian leaned into it, playing the victim for all he was worth. A few relatives chimed in, either defending Brian or trying to calm the situation. Others sent me private messages, expressing their support and sharing their own frustrations about Brian's behavior. "Honestly, Maggie," one cousin texted, "it's about time someone called him out. He's been getting away with too much for way too long." At our next family gathering, the tension was palpable. Conversations felt strained, and people avoided eye contact whenever Brian or I entered the room. Brian sat off to the side, unusually quiet, while Mom fluttered around, trying to keep things light. But the real turning point came when my Aunt Diane, who had always been one of Brian's biggest supporters, finally spoke up. Brian was in the middle of telling a story about how he'd been misunderstood when Aunt Diane interrupted him. "You know, Brian," she said, her tone calm but firm, "it seems like you misunderstand people a lot. Funny how it always ends with you looking like the victim." The room went silent. Brian's face turned red, and for a moment, he looked genuinely flustered. He mumbled something about not wanting to argue and stormed out of the room. After that, the floodgates opened. Relatives who had stayed silent for years started sharing their own experiences with Brian. One cousin admitted he'd borrowed money and never paid it back. An uncle talked about how Brian had bailed on helping with a family event, leaving him scrambling at the last minute. It was like everyone had been waiting for permission to speak up, and now that someone had broken the ice, they couldn't stop. Even Mom seemed shaken. I overheard her telling Brian after the dinner, "Maybe it's time you start thinking about how your actions affect others." For once, she sounded exhausted. Not just from the conflict, but from defending him for so many years. As for me, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't just about Brian anymore. The family was finally seeing what I had endured for years, and they were starting to hold him accountable. But Brian wasn't done. He hosted a small gathering with family friends a week later, and from what I heard, he used it as an opportunity to air his grievances. He framed me as bitter and jealous, claiming I was trying to punish him for no reason. Some family friends even called me afterward, asking what was going on. I calmly explained my side of the story, making it clear I wasn't interested in badmouthing Brian, but simply standing up for myself after years of being dismissed. "He's not used to being called out," I told them. "And that's exactly why I'm doing it now." It felt like a turning point. The cracks in Brian's golden child image were starting to show, and for the first time, it wasn't just me who saw them. The breaking point came when Brian demanded a family meeting. He insisted it was time to fix the drama and set things right, but I knew better. This wasn't about resolving anything. It was about regaining control of the narrative. Mom was, of course, all for it. "We need to come together as a family," she said during one of her many phone calls. "Maggie, can't you just try to meet him halfway?" "I'll come," I told her, "but only if Brian gives a genuine apology. Not another half-hearted, 'I'm sorry if you were hurt.' He needs to own up to what he's done." She hesitated but agreed, likely thinking I'd cave under pressure when the time came. The meeting was set for a Sunday afternoon at Mom and Dad's house. I walked in feeling a mix of nerves and determination. The living room was packed. Relatives sat on couches and folding chairs, while Mom bustled around nervously, trying to keep the atmosphere light. Dad was seated quietly in the corner, watching everything unfold. Brian sat at the head of the room, his arms crossed and his expression defiant. He didn't look like someone ready to apologize. He looked like someone preparing to play the victim. Once everyone settled, Brian wasted no time launching into his monologue. "This whole situation has gotten out of hand," he said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence he always used to charm people. "I feel like I'm being attacked for no reason. I've always tried to be there for this family, but lately, it feels like I'm being scapegoated." I could feel my hands clenching into fists, but I kept my expression neutral. Brian continued, throwing in jabs about how he'd always felt like the black sheep of the family. He even took a swipe at Dad, claiming he'd never felt as loved or supported as I was. The room was quiet when he finished, his words hanging in the air. All eyes turned to me. I knew this was my moment. I stood up, taking a deep breath. "Brian, let's talk about what's actually happening here. This isn't about you being attacked. It's about your actions and how they've affected the rest of us." I began listing specific incidents, one by one. The science project he ruined, the job interview he sabotaged, the countless times he shirked responsibilities and left others to pick up the slack. I didn't raise my voice or get emotional. I simply laid out the facts, each one hitting harder than the last. By the time I finished, Brian looked visibly uncomfortable. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by an awkward silence. To my surprise, other family members began chiming in. Kelly spoke up first, sharing how Brian had borrowed money from her and never paid it back. "Every time I brought it up, you laughed it off like it wasn't a big deal," she said, her voice steady but firm. Then Uncle Ray added his story, recounting how Brian bailed on helping with a family reunion, leaving him scrambling at the last minute. As more relatives shared their grievances, Brian's expression shifted from defiance to panic. His charm, his ability to spin the narrative in his favor, was failing him for the first time. Even Mom, who had been sitting silently up until this point, looked shaken. She finally spoke, her voice trembling. "I thought I was keeping the peace by asking Maggie to let things go," she said. "But I see now that I was just enabling you, Brian. I didn't want to admit it, but I've been unfair." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest Mom had ever come to admitting she was wrong. Under the weight of everyone's stories and Mom's admission, Brian finally broke. He slumped in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sorry for what?" I asked, refusing to let him off the hook. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with frustration and, for the first time, genuine regret. "I'm sorry for making jokes at your expense. I'm sorry for not taking responsibility. And I'm sorry for hurting you and everyone else. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real." For the first time, Brian wasn't trying to charm his way out of trouble or deflect blame. He was owning up to what he'd done, even if it was only a start. I nodded, keeping my voice calm. "Thank you for apologizing, Brian. But words aren't enough. If you're serious about making things right, it's going to take actions, not just apologies." He nodded, his face flushed. "I know. I'll do better." In the weeks that followed, I started to see small but meaningful changes. Brian apologized to Kelly and set up a plan to repay the money he owed her. He offered to help Uncle Ray with an upcoming family event, showing up early to lend a hand. He even reached out to me privately, apologizing again without any audience or pressure. For once, his efforts seemed sincere. The family dynamic began to shift as well. Relatives who had stayed silent for years started holding Brian accountable. When he tried to deflect or make excuses, they gently but firmly called him out. Even Mom made an effort to stop enabling him. She apologized to me for dismissing my feelings in the past and started treating me with more respect. Dad, as always, remained a quiet but steady source of support, subtly encouraging Brian to continue making amends. Things aren't perfect, and they probably never will be. But for the first time, I feel like there's a sense of fairness in our family. I'm no longer carrying the burden of keeping the peace, and Brian is finally learning what it means to take responsibility. The golden child's armor has cracked, and while it's taken years to get here, I finally feel like we're moving forward. It's not the ending I expected, but it's one I can live with. And for the first time in my life, that feels like a victory.